You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with economist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the Financial Times leads with the Prime Minister's insistence that the government's offer of a pay increase of between 5% and 7% for public sector workers is final. The Guardian, however, says that very statement has angered the leaders of the health unions. And with junior doctors on a long strike from today, the Telegraph says they too are now under pressure to give up their action and accept what's on offer. And that issue, the Mail has this blunt headline: will doctors now end their callous strikes? The Eye says 1 million workers will benefit, but that the books will be balanced by cuts in government department budgets rather than new borrowing. The Express, meanwhile, says fees paid by migrants when they come to the UK will also go towards funding the increases. The Mirror sums it up like this: pay relief, but cuts pain. On another story, footballer Dele Alli's revelation that he was sexually abused at the age of 6 and that he's just come out of weeks of rehab for sleeping pill addiction. That's the top story for the Metro. And the Star has a story about climate change and its effects on bees. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Steve Edwards and Salma Shah. Welcome to you both, one in person and one remotely here. We're mixing it up tonight. And we're going to start with the Mail and this headline: will doctors now end their callous strikes? This is the Mail dubbing them callous, isn't it, Salma?
Yes, it is. And you can sort of expect where the newspapers are going to go in terms of their titles as to what position they're going to take on the strikes. And the Mail has been very strident with this big front page on doctors continuing, and junior doctors certainly saying that they're going to continue with the strikes, whilst teachers and the teaching unions have responded positively, saying that they would ask their members to end the wave of classroom strikes. And this is obviously off the back of the fact that they seem like they're going to get what they want, or at least some of what they want, from the Prime Minister. So hopefully there'll be some kind of end to this stasis for the government.
And Steve, the Mail choosing to call them callous, the strikes by junior doctors, this does put added pressure on them, as well as that from Rishi Sunak saying, you know, no matter how many more strikes go ahead, the offer isn't going to change.
Yeah, this is a fascinating story on so many levels. And the broader context is, here is a country with anemic economic growth, with governments either ideologically or too scared to put up taxes. So how do you pay for pay demands at a time of stubborn inflation? And Rishi Sunak has sort of found a way today of doing it, in that he claims it's going to come from existing budgets. But the reaction has been very diverse. Teachers have called off their strikes. Some in the NHS still are furious and plan to go ahead. But all sides are having to adapt to this situation where, without economic growth, without higher tax revenues, there isn't going to be the money if a government's not going to borrow for it. And so it's unsurprising in a way that the tensions of recent months are not fully resolved with a click of a finger from Rishi Sunak today.
Yes, and you mentioned there how it's all going to be paid for. In the Express, we're offered one of the solutions that the government's looking at, and that's increasing fees paid by migrants. These are visa fees, and suggesting that there will be significant rises in those, Salma.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this, which is not quite obvious to most people, is that we actually have one of the most expensive visa fee systems in the world. And it was all part of the hostile environment under Theresa May's leadership of the Home Office. So it'll be interesting to see what happens down the line in terms of fights between departments about where that money is actually going to end up. So whilst you can say that some of this is going to be paid by visa fees, we actually don't know how much that is and where it ends up going, and whether it will be towards pay increases or indeed preventing schools from having to take the pain of the pay increases, which is what this is designed to do.
And Steve, from what you've read, the sources that will fund these pay rises, do they seem sufficient to meet the demand?
Emphatically not. This whole thing about where the money's coming from reminds me of the sort of tax and spend debate that Labour politicians are always asked in the build-up to an election. So what if you do this? Oh, there'll be a black hole. We're going to put 10p here and 5p there. They're scrambling around, ministers, trying to find ways of showing that this is going to be paid for without wholly knowing how it's going to be done. These are big increases in terms of a departmental budget to find cost cutting. And the examples we've got so far will it's not at all clear how much revenue will come from these alleged savings, but they're easy ones to put forward as examples on day one. The reality is services will be impacted in any sort of overall cuts to pay for this pay rise. And they won't say that today, but that's the reality.
And do you agree with Salma that we're likely to see many internal tussles over budgets and what cuts might have to be made?
Yeah, and in a build-up to an election, I think in the end they'll busk it somehow. In other words, they will not impose painful cuts, but they will sort of, in theory, have to if they're going to pay for it from existing departmental budgets. I think money will materialise somehow or other without the imposition of tangible, painful cuts. I heard a schools minister say, oh no, there won't be any impact on classrooms and so on. Well, where's the money going to come from? The thing that's always asked of Rachel Reeves and others from the Labour side. And they'll find it somehow or other. But I doubt if there will be painful, tangible cuts in the build-up to an election.
Salma, to the FT, and as I was saying before, Rishi Sunak has, they're describing it as he's thrown down the gauntlet to trade unions by announcing pay rises for public sector workers between 5 and 7%, insisting no amount of strikes will change his final offer. This is it, according to the Prime Minister.
Yes, and I think that there is a lot of store to put by that, because it's not least because he wants an end to strikes, but so much of what he wants to deliver is based on the ending of these strikes. So if we go back to his 5 priorities from the beginning of the year, one of them is very much based on waiting times and hospitals. So in order to get that moving again, he really needs doctors and nurses to get back to work and get to be as productive as possible. I also think that there is another interesting bit of the FT, and that is about that fiscal discipline piece in advance of a general election. So as Steve has rightly said, Labour politicians are always going to be asked, where is the money going to come from? And people are very resistant to the idea of borrowing for wage increases. And so you've got here, Hunt promises no extra borrowing. So at the same time, he's trying to manage these two things, the fiscal discipline and trying to meet one of his key 5 pledges.
So the Prime Minister insisting that the offer is final. In The Guardian, we read that unions are furious. Steve.
Yeah, and so on we go. He's got to say it's final, but he has got to get the health unions back to work for the reason Salma argued. There was speculation that he was opposed to giving in to these pay review recommendations, but he had to, because he has to get these people back to work in order to have any hope of meeting one of his so-called 5 priorities of reducing waiting lists. He also has to say this is a final offer, given he was indicating before that he might not go this far. So he can't say, look, just hold on a second, you'll get more from us. But the kind of tension between health unions regarding this as inadequate and saying doctors are going to go off to other countries where they pay more, which incidentally is an issue, that's not going to go away with today's announcement.
Yes, and Salma, the Mirror suggesting or predicting that the cash coming from existing budgets will mean that there will inevitably be cuts to services.
Yeah, I mean, and that's just without doubt. You've got high inflation, real terms, finding new budgets, it's going to mean cuts. And so we go back to the point of there's going to be arguments, there are going to be tensions, and there are going to be a whole host of bad stories that are going to come out as a result of cuts to services.
Steve, they use the phrase robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Well, yeah, but as I say, in a pre-election year, the amount of robbing that goes on internally is pretty limited. I think, they are being tough. They are proclaiming fiscal prudence, fiscal conservatism within the context of accepting the pay review propositions. But I wonder whether there will be painful cuts in the build-up to the election. I think it'll all be pushed beyond the election.
Salma, let's quick look finally at the eye and questions about whether the government's approach is the correct one to handling the public pay sector dispute and actually not wanting to borrow more money. Are they going about it the right way?
I mean, they don't have a lot of options and they don't have a lot of room to manoeuvre. And I think what's interesting here is that the eye says that UK public debt is on course to hit an eye-watering 310% of GDP by the 2070s. And so, pushing that message forward is certainly at the forefront of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor's mind at the moment. Are they handling it well? There's a lot of mixed messages going on. Are they going to accept the pay review? Are they not? And so we finally have this out. I think they could be a lot better about the communications and the messaging.
We shall see whether they have handled it well, resulting in whether the strikes continue or not. Salma and Steve, for the moment, thank you. We are going to take a break coming up. It's understood the BBC was preparing its own investigation into Hugh Edwards' conduct before the allegations about him came to light. We'll be discussing that next. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview, still with me, Steve Richards and Salma Shah. So let's have a look at this story in the Telegraph. And we read that the BBC was investigating allegations about Hugh Edwards' conduct before the Sun published its story. This is the latest to come out.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that, you've already mentioned that Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, is going to be up in front of a parliamentary committee next week. And this is clearly going to form part of their questioning. And so, one of the questions that sort of jumps out at me from this story is, how was the handling been? And from my perspective, it's not been great, because on one side you have the editorial now that we understand has been investigating Hugh Edwards, and on the other side you've got the corporation and the corporate side of the BBC as, presumably defending Hugh Edwards behind the scenes before his name came forward. So I think there's going to have to be some serious unpacking and how the BBC has actually handled this and what their processes and protocols have been around this instance.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I've covered a lot of so-called BBC crises, and Salma and I have both worked at the BBC. And I remember one of the other big crises, I won't go into any of the details, asking one of the managers, for me to get a sense of who's running the BBC response to this crisis, who should I speak to? And they said, well, it's all a bit complicated. And I knew there would be trouble ahead. And it's always hard to kind of find where the lines of responsibility and accountability are often at the BBC, and that's part of the problem. But what I would say also is this, that yes, it's interesting that the BBC news side were investigating Hugh Edwards, but over precisely what? What form were these texts? If it's flirtatious texts, he wouldn't have been the first person in a newsroom to do that. I'm not saying there isn't a human interest story here. Clearly there is. But still, weighing up its significance is difficult until we know more about it.
OK. Salma, let's look at this story finally in The Guardian, and that is that the UK's response to a threat from China is inadequate. What do we know?
So this is interesting because this is a comment that's coming from the Intelligence and Security Committee, which actually receives secret intelligence in private closed sessions. So the fact that they're saying this is not only intriguing, but actually quite worrying, because they have talked about Chinese state institutions aggressively targeting the UK, and that without swift and decisive action, we could end up in a nightmarish scenario. And this is what I'm quoting from, that represents not just a commercial challenge, but an existential threat to liberal democratic systems. And even though it's on the front page, it's quite small. And this definitely needs, I think, a lot of teasing and a lot of scrutiny, because this is a very, very important parliamentary committee.
Steve, worrying? They're talking about a whole of state assault by the Chinese government.
It's so sweeping and extensive, the degree in which they suggest almost a takeover could take place on a whole range of different areas. And it's been so fascinating. This government, which has in effect been in power for 13 years, have had so many different approaches to China. And I still don't think it's resolved, from Cameron and Osborne being very keen, Boris Johnson actually very keen to form quite a close trading relationship, but was stopped by his party. And now we have a committee report like this, which suggests that it's almost kind of too late. And so mastering what to do about this increasingly economic and defence superpower is one of the great challenges. And there has been no coherence in the last 13 years.